They called them eunuchs. In the hush of palace corridors, in the shadow of throne rooms, in the private chambers of emperors, a special kind of servant held a curious and paradoxical power. Stripped of sexual function, yet entrusted with intimate trust. For centuries in China, eunuchs were men who had undergone castration, entering service in the imperial court where their value was built not just on obedience, but on anonymity, loyalty, and the peculiar intimacy of having none of the usual family ties. Their existence is well documented, their power both resented and relied upon, legendary. But what about female eunuchs, women without the reproductive capacity or sexual agency? Did they ever truly exist in imperial China? Or is the idea a myth that has grown larger in the gaps of memory, rumor, and fantasy? We begin with what the historical records tell us. The term huangguan refers clearly to male eunuchs, men who were castrated, assigned to guard inner courts, or serve in roles that required them to be outside ordinary gendered family life. They were male-bodied, male-identified, as far as sources indicate, and their social role was shaped by their physical alteration. Histories of powerful male eunuchs, like Li Lianying in the late Qing dynasty, who rose from poverty to be a confidant of Empress Dowager Cixi, are well documented. They wielded influence, handled palace finances, acted as intermediaries between the emperor, ministers, and even foreign visitors. There is, however, no solid evidence that women were ever similarly castrated or designated female eunuchs in the historical records with official or legal recognition. Some later folklore, drama, or modern speculative pieces mention female eunuchs, but closer scrutiny reveals that these stories are rarely corroborated by primary sources. Some are misunderstandings of roles women did occupy: palace maids, attendants, women servants, but not eunuchs in the technical sense of castration or sterilization. In studies and historical scholarship, no reputable records seem to support a female counterpart to the male eunuch institution in imperial China. So why does the idea persist? And what is the meaning of thinking about female eunuchs in modern times? The persistence owes much to myths, sensationalism, romanticization, and gendered interpretations. To some storytellers, a female eunuch becomes a poetic symbol of control, loss, discipline, or betrayal of natural sexuality. They show up in modern articles, speculative history, YouTube videos, and memes. They offer an image of the palace as a place where bodies are re-engineered for the sake of power or purity. But historically, those stories tend to collapse on examination. If they don't have documentation, or appear only in late secondary sources, or come from outside China, the basis is weak. It's also worth asking, even if there were no female eunuchs in a technical sense, were there women whose roles approximated some aspects of that condition? Women heavily controlled, whose fertility was regulated, whose sexual agency was constrained, maybe even women interned in the palace who lived under vows or constraints. Yes, women in the inner court, concubines, palace maids, attendants, had strict, ritualized lives. Some were selected at very young ages, lived isolated from family, under surveillance, forbidden relationships. They existed in a world where the capacity to bear children or form independent relations was bounded by palace hierarchy, favor, and power. But this is very different from biological castration. Looking at male eunuchs, we see sharp physical, emotional, and social costs. Castration, sometimes partial, sometimes full, carried enormous risk of infection, social stigma, health complications, and always the loss of normal sexual and reproductive life. The body changed, hormone levels altered, emotional landscapes shifted, identity and perception in society warped, yet male eunuchs could rise to positions of power, bargain authority, sometimes even become kingmakers. Their stories are saturated with contradiction. revered and reviled, invisible in some moments, central in others. The myth of female eunuchs, in contrast, often seems to serve a different set of cultural anxieties. The idea of a woman made sterile or without sexual agency can be invoked to express fears of female power, demands of purity, or exotic fantasies of gender inversion. It can be a metaphor for women who sacrifice their autonomy or who are kept in silence. Because in many histories, women's voices are the ones muted. Records about women are fewer, less preserved. That gap becomes fertile ground for myth. People ask, did women ever live like the eunuchs? Did some get forced sterilization? Did some swear chastity? Live in conditions that made them eunuch-like? These questions hover in rumor and legend more than archival proof. Some scholars who explore court life in Ming and Qing dynasties note that women attendants may have had their bodies managed, diet, rest, behavior, but not in the way that male eunuchs had genital mutilation. They might be prevented from marrying, kept from children, but legal and medical documentation of female castration is absent. The power asymmetries between genders in imperial China are real, profound, documented, but biological eunuchs of female bodies are not. This absence matters. The erasure of female eunuchs may tell us something more profound: how history remembers, what it values, and whose bodies are measured against what ideal of normality. Why might sources suppress or ignore stories like female eunuchs? In part because eunuchs themselves were embattled in historical memory. They were both feared and despised for their sexual otherness, accused of depravity, power-grabbing, corruption. Historians and reformers often vilified them. In the late Qing and Republican eras, eunuchs were symbols of the old, corrupt imperial system that must be abolished. So stories that complicated the binary of male/female or introduced female castration would be disruptive, even scandalous, to the moral narratives reformers wanted. Better to leave them unspoken or mythic than to be forced to provide proof. Some writers outside of China have picked up the notion of female eunuchs, sometimes contributing sensationalist interpretations. Here lies a tension between what is popular in media and what is supported in archival sources. A modern blog might claim female eunuchs served in palace specifically assigned to substitute services for concubines. But it's not the same as documented historical role with medical procedure, legal recognition, or consistent practice. My investigation into archival material, court records, and contemporary scholarship suggests that such claims are not substantiated. We do have examples of how male eunuchs were sometimes imagined or depicted in literature, drama, art, as gender fluid or other, almost feminized in their manner, voice, and role. Their lack of children, altered bodies, presence in the inner palace, access to the private lives of men and women, all of this set up a set of cultural associations. In some fictional or dramatic narratives, male eunuchs are feminized or shown as protective mothers or caretakers inside court dynamics. This kind of metaphorical role can sometimes be conflated by readers or viewers into misunderstanding, conflated with female eunuch ideas. Then there's personal testimony. The lives of male eunuchs, especially in later imperial eras, are often documented in memoirs, rare but existent, official court records, and even in folklore. Sun Yaoding, considered the last eunuch of China, lived into the 20th century, and his life offers insight into both the physical realities of castration and the emotional, social cost. He speaks of identity, of loss, of service, of invisibility, but always as someone who, despite losing male sexual reproductive functions, identified with the role and gender expectations placed upon him as male. There is no record that he or others identified as female or operated under female eunuch status. Some future scholars argue that the myth of female eunuchs reveals more about how sex, gender, power, and purity have been tied up across Chinese dynasties. It reflects anxieties around women's sexuality, patriarchal control, purity rituals, and the policing of female bodies. The idea of erasure, then, is twofold. Women's experiences are often marginalized, and the boundary between myth and history becomes slippery when feminism, pop culture, or moralism take hold of the image of eunuchs. Understanding all this matters because myths shape how we think about gender history, how we imagine power in past societies, and how those imagined power dynamics inform today. Gender norms, sexual politics, ideas of purity, punishment, body autonomy. If we believe myths without questioning them, we misrepresent lives. We erase real histories of men who were eunuchs, and we perpetuate misunderstandings about women's roles under patriarchal rule. By facing the evidence and acknowledging absence, we restore a more honest picture. Female eunuchs, in the historical legal sense, don't seem to have existed. But women with constrained sexuality, women serving in inner courts, women under absolute surveillance, those whose bodies and reproductive powers were curtailed in other, subtler ways. They did exist. Their erasures tell us as much as the lives that are recorded. So let's consider what late-stage imperial China, the late Qing court, the collapse of the monarchy in the early 20th century tell us. As the last generations of eunuchs dwindled, and as China modernized, the symbolic power of eunuchs transformed. If this deep dive challenged what you thought, share it with someone you trust. If you want to see more explorations into forgotten histories and unsettling myths, hit the like button and subscribe. And don't forget, whenever you hear a sensational claim about history, pause, ask, check the sources. Because some truths are buried under centuries. And some myths are the memories we dare to forget.